Need a wife by tomorrow. Those words hung in the stale, whiskey-soaked air of the tavern, heavier than the cast-iron stove in the corner. He wasn't some desperate dirt farmer. He was a man carved from high country granite, reeking of pine pitch and untanned leather. When she looked up from her mending, she didn't laugh. She didn't swoon. She asked a single quiet question that shattered the fragile peace of the valley, tying their desperate fates together forever. Boot leather creaked as Wakely shifted his weight in the hard wooden chair. It was a miserable, undersized thing, built for men who worked behind desks and slept on feather mattresses. Wakely belonged to neither category. His knees pressed uncomfortably against the edge of the polished mahogany desk, his massive frame dwarfing the fragile furniture of the assayer's office. He smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of the beaver traps he'd spent the last 4 months hauling through the frozen creeks of the upper ridge. Hiram Cutler sat across from him. The man had hands softer than rising dough and wore a waistcoat that cost more than Wakely's entire winter haul. Cutler tapped a silver fountain pen against a stack of thick, cream-coloured papers. Tap, tap, tap. The sound drilled into Wakely's skull, sharp and irritating, right behind his eyes. "It is not a matter of personal preference, Mr. Green," Cutler said. His voice was oiled, smooth, and entirely devoid of empathy. "It is the law. The Homestead Act of this territory, specifically the amendments passed last autumn, require a man to be the head of a recognized household to claim a tract larger than 50 acres. Your brother's deed was provisional." Wakely swallowed. His throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. "Elias filed that claim 5 years ago. We built the cabin. We cleared the lower pasture. We put 3 miles of fence line in the dirt. My brother bled out on that land when the cougar took him. It's my land." "It was Elias's land," Cutler corrected gently, leaning back in his leather chair. The leather sighed under him. "And Elias is dead. You inherited the provisional deed. But the provision clearly states that by the 5th anniversary of the filing, which is tomorrow at sundown, the claimant must present proof of a household. A wife, Mr. Green, or a legal dependent." Wakely stared at the papers. He couldn't read the dense, swirling cursive well enough to argue. He recognized his brother's jagged signature at the bottom. Faded now, a ghost etched in ink. Elias had always been the one with the plans. Elias was going to marry the Miller girl from 2 valleys over, settle down, fill the cabin with loud, messy children. Wakely was just the muscle, the hunter, the ghost who lived in the loft and preferred the company of the mules. "Tomorrow," Wakely repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Tomorrow by 5 o'clock. Cutler confirmed. He didn't smile, but there was a distinct, hungry gleam in his pale eyes. Cutler owned the lumber mill. The timber on Wakely's ridge was old-growth pine, thick and straight, worth thousands in board feet. Cutler had been circling the property since the dirt was fresh on Elias's grave. "If you cannot produce a marriage certificate, the land defaults back to the territory. And then it goes to public auction, where Cutler would buy it for pennies on the dollar." Wakely stood up. The sudden movement knocked the undersized chair backward. It clattered loudly against the oak floorboards. Cutler flinched, pulling his soft hands back from the desk, a flash of genuine fear crossing his face. Wakely was 6 feet and 4 inches of rough, unyielding muscle, scarred by ice, claws, and careless men. He could reach across the desk and crush Cutler's windpipe before the banker could even draw a breath to scream. The violent urge flared hot and bright in Wakely's chest. His thick fingers twitched, curling inward toward his palms. He felt the familiar, dangerous heat creeping up the back of his neck. Then he looked down at the paper again. He saw Elias's name. Wakely uncurled his fists. He exhaled a long, ragged breath that smelled of stale coffee. He didn't pick up the chair. Without another word, he turned his back on the banker and walked out of the office. The street outside was a chaotic churn of mud, horse manure, and melted snow. Wagons rattled past, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding deep ruts into the main thoroughfare of town. Men in bowler hats hurried along the boardwalks, their faces buried in woolen scarves. Wakely hated this place. He hated the noise. He hated the constant, suffocating press of humanity. Out on the ridge, the silence was absolute. You could hear an owl drop from a branch a quarter-mile away. Here, the noise was a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. He stepped off the boardwalk, his heavy boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing muck. A passing carriage driver cursed at him, the whip cracking sharply in the damp air. Wakely ignored him. He just kept walking, his mind a slow, grinding wheel of panic and grief. He had 24 hours. He needed a woman willing to tether herself to a half-feral trapper who barely spoke. He needed a piece of paper. He needed a miracle. Wakely pushed his hands deep into the pockets of his heavy canvas coat. His knuckles scraped against a lone, smooth river stone he carried for luck. It wasn't working. He walked until the grand brick facades of the town centre gave way to the dilapidated wooden structures of the south end, where the mud was deeper and the smells turned sour. He stopped in front of a sagging two-story building. A wooden sign hung by a single rusted hinge above the door, reading, "The Rusty Nail." It was mid-afternoon, but the windows were dark, smeared with grease and coal dust. Wakely wiped his wet face with the back of his sleeve. He pushed the swinging doors open and stepped into the gloom. Stale beer and rotting sawdust. The smell hit Wakely like a physical blow as he crossed the threshold. The tavern was dim, lit only by a few sputtering oil lamps bracketed to the walls. The air was thick with cheap tobacco smoke, hanging in hazy blue layers just beneath the exposed ceiling joists. It was a place for men who didn't want to be found, or who had nowhere else to go. A dozen patrons occupied the room. 3 miners sat hunched over a corner table, nursing cloudy glasses of rye. A pair of off-duty drovers slept in a booth by the dead fireplace. Behind the long, scarred mahogany bar stood Caleb, the proprietor, violently scrubbing a glass with a dirty rag. Wakely walked to the far end of the bar, avoiding eye contact. His heavy tread made the floorboards groan. He tossed a silver piece onto the sticky wood. It landed with a dull clink. "Bottle." Wakely grunted. "Leave the glass." Caleb didn't argue. He took one look at Wakely's face, swept the coin into his apron, and slid a dark green bottle across the bar. Wakely pulled the cork out with his teeth, spitting it onto the floor. He took a long, burning swallow. The cheap liquor seared a path down his throat, pooling in his stomach like liquid fire. It didn't numb the panic, but it took the sharpest edges off. He leaned against the wood, staring blankly at the wall of half-empty bottles behind the bar. He had to think. Who in this miserable town would marry him? The saloon girls wouldn't do it. Cutler would have the judge invalidate the certificate on moral grounds in a heartbeat. He needed a respectable woman, or at least one respectable enough to pass muster on a piece of paper. He took another drink. The alcohol was loosening the tight, painful knot in his chest, replacing it with a reckless, hollow desperation. Down the bar, near the kitchen doors, a figure moved in the shadows. It was a woman. She was dragging a heavy wooden mop bucket across the uneven floorboards. The rusty metal casters shrieked softly with every pull. She wore a faded blue dress that had been washed too many times, the hem damp and heavy with dirty water. A grey apron was tied tightly around her waist. Her hair, the colour of wet straw, was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian bun, though several damp strands had escaped and plastered themselves against her pale neck. Wakely watched her work. There was no grace in her movements, only a grim, mechanical efficiency. She plunged a rough bristle brush into the murky water, dropped to her knees, and began to scrub the floor beneath an empty table. Her shoulders strained. The knuckles of her hands were bright red, chapped raw by harsh lye soap and freezing water. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the girls in the magazines at the general store were. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp, and pronounced beneath skin that hadn't seen enough sunlight. There was a faint, yellowish bruise fading along her jawline. Wakely looked away, taking a third pull from the bottle. His chest felt tight again. Time was bleeding out. The sun outside was already sinking lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the frosted mud. Tomorrow at sundown. Elias's cabin, the fence line, the spot under the old oak tree where his brother was buried. Cutler was going to tear it all down to get to the timber. The miners in the corner erupted into sudden, harsh laughter over a hand of cards. The noise jarred Wakely. His grip on the neck of the bottle tightened until his knuckles went white. He couldn't just sit here. He couldn't lose it. It was the only thing holding him to the earth. Before his brain could catch up with the raw, surging panic in his blood, Wakely pushed himself off the bar. The sudden movement caught the attention of the room. The miners stopped laughing. Caleb paused his scrubbing. Wakely stood in the center of the room. He felt massive, stupid, and entirely exposed. Sweat pricked his scalp beneath his thick hair. He opened his mouth. His voice, unused to carrying across a room, came out like a gravel slide. "Need a wife by tomorrow." The words hung in the air. The silence that followed was absolute, thick and heavy. A piece of burning coal popped in the iron stove. Wakely stood frozen. He regretted it instantly. The heat of humiliation burned up his neck, turning his ears crimson. He was a fool. A desperate, loud fool. He looked at the floor, wanting the rotting planks to simply open up and swallow him whole. One of the miners snorted. Then another chuckled. Within seconds, the three men in the corner were roaring with laughter. "Ain't we all mountain man?" One of them hollered, slapping the table. "You trying to scare one into it? I got a mule out back might take a liking to you," another shouted, wiping a tear from his soot-stained face. The laughter echoed off the walls, sharp and cruel. Wakely's jaw clenched. He felt the familiar, blinding red anger rising, the urge to cross the room and shatter the miner's jaw. His boots felt heavy as lead. He turned back toward the bar, intending to grab his bottle and walk out into the cold, to freeze on the trail rather than face this. Then, the scraping of the bristle brush stopped. The cessation of the rhythmic scrubbing was a small thing, but in the echoing mockery of the tavern, it was as distinct as a gunshot. Wakely didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes locked on the amber glass of the bottles behind the bar. He heard the splash of water as the brush was dropped into the bucket. He heard the wet squelch of heavy, worn boots standing up against the floorboards. The laughter from the corner died down, replaced by a low, curious murmuring. Wakely turned slowly. The woman in the faded blue dress was walking toward him. She moved deliberately, ignoring the stares of the miners and the wide-eyed look from Caleb behind the bar. As she stepped into the dim pool of light cast by the nearest oil lamp, Wakely saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were grey, not a soft, cloudy grey, but the hard, impenetrable colour of a winter sky right before a blizzard breaks. They looked old, older than the rest of her face, which couldn't have seen more than 25 winters. She stopped 3 feet from him, crossing her raw, chapped arms over her chest. The smell of harsh lye soap and wet wood emanated from her, cutting through the tavern stench. Wakely stared down at her. He felt his throat lock. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he let them hang limply at his sides. "You meant it?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a low, raspy tenor that held no mockery, just exhaustion. Wakely nodded once, a stiff, jerky motion. "Yes." She tilted her head, studying him. She looked at his heavy, scarred boots, the grease-stained canvas of his coat, the thick, unkempt beard that hid half his face. She looked at the size of his shoulders, the sheer, imposing bulk of him. Wakely felt like a horse being examined at auction. He wanted to look away, but her grey eyes pinned him to the spot. "Why?" she asked. "Land." Wakely grunted, struggling to force the words out. My brother's claim. Law says I need a household by sundown tomorrow, or the bank takes the deed. Sells it to the mill. She absorbed this information without a change in expression. She didn't look at him with pity. She didn't look at him with greed. She just looked at him with a cold, calculating pragmatism. She uncrossed her arms and looked down at her own hands. The knuckles were cracked, tiny fissures of dried blood tracing the skin. She rubbed her thumb over the yellowing bruise on her jawline. It was an unconscious gesture, one born of habit rather than pain. I have debts, she said quietly, her eyes still on her hands. $300 to the man who owns this place. Board, room, and a mistake my father made before he drank himself to death. I scrub floors 14 hours a day, and the interest grows faster than my wages. Wakely swallowed. $300 was a fortune. It was more than he made in 2 trapping seasons. But if he lost the ridge, he lost his home. He lost Elias's grave. He lost the only place on earth where he could breathe. I have 400 in gold dust, Wakely said. The words tasted like iron. Buried under the hearth at the cabin? She looked up at him then. The transaction was hanging in the air between them, cold and brutal. A piece of paper for a life. A pile of gold for freedom. It was a business arrangement, born of mud and desperation. I'll sign your paper, she said. Wakely let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The tension in his chest eased a fraction of an inch. I'll get the gold. We find a judge in the morning. He turned to walk back to the bar to retrieve his bottle. He was ready to leave, to escape the suffocating air of the tavern and the hard, grey eyes of the woman. Wait, she said. Wakely stopped. He turned his heavy head to look at her over his shoulder. She had closed the distance between them. She was standing barely a foot away now. Wakely had to look down at a sharp angle to meet her gaze. The exhaustion in her face had momentarily vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying tension. Her hands were balled into fists at her sides. She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his hands, specifically at his knuckles, which were thick with calluses and scarred from a lifetime of violence. When she finally met his eyes, the question she asked didn't just shatter the fragile silence of the room. It shattered the thick, protective ice Wakely had built around his own soul. When you get angry, she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray the terror beneath her cold exterior. Do you use your hands, or do you just walk out the door? Wakely froze. The breath stalled in his lungs. He didn't expect that. He had expected questions about the cabin. Was it warm? Was there enough food for the winter? Would he require her to work the trap lines? He expected a negotiation of labor. He hadn't expected to be confronted with the ghost of whoever had put that yellow bruise on her jaw. Wakely looked down at his massive, scarred hands. They could break a man's neck. They could snap a wolf's jaw. They were weapons, and she knew it. She was looking at a cage, wondering if the bear inside it was prone to turning on its keeper. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Wakely realized, with a sudden, painful clarity, that her life was a series of choices between different types of violence. She was weighing the known cruelty of the tavern against the unknown capacity of the giant standing before her. He slowly opened his hands, turning his palms upward, exposing the raw, blistered skin where the trap chains had bitten into him. I leave, Wakely said. His voice was barely a rough rasp, quieter than the sputtering of the oil lamps. I go to the woods. I don't hit. He paused, looking directly into her winter-grey eyes. He let the absolute truth of his nature bleed into the words. I have killed men, he told her, the admission tasting like bile, but I have never struck something that couldn't strike back. She searched his face for a long time. The seconds ticked by, heavy as stones. Wakely didn't blink. He let her see the tired, broken thing behind his eyes. He let her see that he was just as trapped as she was. Finally, the rigid tension left her shoulders. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, her gaze dropping back to his open, calloused hands. "My name is Jamila," she said quietly. "Wakely," he replied. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. She didn't offer her hand to shake. She just turned around, walked back to the bucket, and picked up the heavy bristle brush. "Tomorrow at 8, Wakely," she said without looking back. "I'll be out front. Don't be late." Morning arrived with a bitter, biting frost that rhymed the edges of the boardwalk in jagged white crystals. Wakely stood beside his buckboard wagon outside the tavern, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. He had been there since 7:30. Tied to the hitching post, his 2 mules, Barnaby and Ruth, stamped their hooves impatiently against the frozen mud. In Wakely's heavy coat pocket sat a stiff leather pouch. It contained 16 ounces of river-panned gold, the entire savings Elias had hidden beneath the hearthstone. It felt like a stone pulling at Wakely's posture. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the tavern groaned open. Jamila stepped out into the harsh morning light. She wore the same faded blue dress, but she had pinned a dark, threadbare woolen shawl tightly around her narrow shoulders. In her right hand, she gripped the handle of a battered carpet bag. It was remarkably small. Whatever life she had built in this miserable town, it fit into a single, sagging bag. Wakely stepped forward. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out the heavy leather pouch, and held it out. Jamila stopped on the edge of the boardwalk. She looked at the pouch, then up at Wakely's face. Her grey eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the deep purple exhaustion of a sleepless night. But her jaw was set. She reached out and took the gold. It was heavier than she expected. Her wrist dipped slightly under the weight. "Wait here," she murmured. She turned and went back inside. Wakely stood by the wagon, listening to the muffled sounds through the tavern window. A heavy thud on a wooden bar. The sharp, reedy voice of Caleb arguing. A moment later, the distinct, metallic clatter of a brass weighing scale. 10 minutes passed. Wakely checked the sky. The grey clouds were thickening, promising more snow by nightfall. When Jamila emerged again, her hands were empty. The tension that had held her shoulders rigidly near her ears had loosened slightly. She didn't look back at the tavern. She walked straight to the wagon and waited. Wakely moved to her side, offering a thick, calloused hand to help her up onto the wooden bench. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her small, raw hand in his. Her skin was freezing. He pulled her up with effortless, terrifying strength. The magistrate's office smelled intensely of cheap peppermint oil and stale pipe tobacco. Judge Harrison, a man with a perpetually runny nose and trembling hands, sat behind a desk piled high with disorganized ledgers. He didn't ask questions. For $2, paid from Wakely's remaining silver, the judge droned through a shortened version of the vows, his eyes constantly darting toward the window. "Do you, Wakely Green, take this woman?" The words meant nothing. They were just sounds in a cramped, airless room. Wakely looked at Jamila. She was staring straight ahead at a crack in the plaster wall, her face completely unreadable. "I do," Wakely grunted. "And do you, Jamila?" The judge squinted at a scrap of paper. "Jamila Miller, take this man." "I do," she said. Her raspy voice didn't waver. "Sign here." The scratch of the steel nib against the thick parchment sounded violently loud. Wakely signed his name in blocky, uneven letters. Jamila signed with a swift, fluid cursive that spoke of an education entirely unsuited for scrubbing tavern floors. Judge Harrison stamped the bottom of the page with a heavy brass seal. Thump. It was done. Wakely took the paper. He rolled it carefully and slid it into a tin cylinder he'd brought for the occasion. Without a word, he turned and led his new wife out of the office. They didn't stop to celebrate. The clock was ticking. They drove the wagon straight to the assayer's office. Hiram Cutler was sipping tea from a porcelain cup when Wakely pushed the door open. The banker smiled, a thin, oily expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Green, I didn't expect to see you again. Come to hand over the keys to the padlocks?" Wakely didn't speak. He walked to the mahogany desk, pulled the parchment from the tin cylinder, and slapped it flat onto the polished wood. Cutler's smile vanished. He set his teacup down with a sharp clatter. He leaned forward, his soft eyes scanning the document. He read it once. Then he read it again, his manicured fingernail tracing the fresh ink of the judge's signature. He looked up, his gaze sliding past Wakely to settle on Jamila, who stood quietly near the door. "Judge Harrison," Cutler muttered, his voice tight. He leaned back, the leather chair sighing in protest. "Well, this is highly irregular." "It's legal," Wakely said. The rumble in his chest vibrated through the floorboards. "The deed." Cutler stared at him with pure, undiluted venom. He opened a lower drawer, retrieved a heavy manila folder, and tossed it onto the desk. "You have your provisional clearance, Green. The land is yours. For now." Cutler stood up, smoothing his expensive waistcoat. "But a piece of paper doesn't cut firewood. It doesn't trap beaver. And it doesn't keep a delicate city woman from freezing to death when the January drifts hit the roofline. I'll keep the auction papers drafted, just in case." Wakely scooped up the deed and the marriage certificate. He wanted to reach across the desk. He wanted to show Cutler exactly what his hands could do. Instead, he felt a light, tentative pressure on his elbow. Jamila had stepped up beside him. Her fingers barely brushed the rough canvas of his sleeve. "We are losing daylight, Wakely," she said calmly. Wakely looked down at her. She wasn't looking at Cutler. She was looking at him, anchoring him, reminding him of his promise from the night before. "I go to the woods. I don't hit." He exhaled a jagged breath. He turned his back on the banker and followed his wife out the door. Uphill, the world changed. The rutted mud of the town gave way to a steep, rocky trail that wound like a pale ribbon up the flank of the mountain. The noise of the sawmills and shouting drovers faded, replaced by the rhythmic, straining snorts of the mules and the crunch of iron-rimmed wagon wheels over loose shale. Wakely drove the buckboard in silence. He sat hunched forward, his massive shoulders absorbing the constant jolts of the uneven trail. He knew this path blindly. He knew which switchbacks held ice in the shadows, which deadfalls to steer around. But today, the familiar journey felt acutely different. He was hyper-aware of the woman sitting beside him. Jamila rode the buckboard seat like a sailor navigating a violent storm. She gripped the wooden edge of the bench with both hands, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. Every time the wagon pitched over a heavy root, her teeth clicked together. She didn't complain. She just endured. The altitude climbed. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the astringent scent of crushed pine needles and distant snow. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation. Wakely noticed her shivering. It was a subtle thing at first, a slight tremor in her jaw, a stiffening of her spine. But as they passed the timberline, moving into the dense, ancient stands of lodgepole pine, the shivering became violent. Her threadbare shawl was utterly useless against the mountain wind. He pulled back on the leather reins. "Whoa!" The mules stopped, their sides heaving, steam rolling off their flanks. The sudden silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket pressing against their eardrums. Jamila looked at him, panic flashing briefly in her grey eyes. "Why are we stopping?" Wakely didn't answer. He stood up, stepped carefully over the seat, and reached into the bed of the wagon. He dragged out a massive, heavy buffalo hide. It was stiff, smelling strongly of wood smoke, old grease, and wild animal. He stepped back over the seat and dropped the heavy hide directly into her lap. "Wrap it," he ordered. Jamila stared at the ugly, matted fur. She wrinkled her nose slightly at the smell, but pragmatism won out. She pulled the heavy hide up over her shoulders, cocooning herself within it. The shivering slowly began to subside. "Thank you," she muttered, her voice muffled by the thick fur. Wakely gave a short, rough nod and snapped the reins. "Walk on." They rode for another 2 hours as the afternoon sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting the trail into deep, bruised purple shadows. Wakely felt a strange, hollow knot forming in his stomach. He was bringing a stranger into Elias's sanctuary. This mountain was supposed to be theirs. Now it belonged to a woman he had purchased in a bar room. "Almost there," Wakely said. It was the first time he had spoken since offering the blanket. Jamila leaned forward, peering through the darkening pines. The trees broke suddenly, revealing a wide, sloping clearing. At the far end, nestled against a backdrop of sheer granite, sat the cabin. It was rough-hewn, built of massive, unpeeled pine logs chinked with grey mud. The roof was a steep pitch of split cedar shakes. It wasn't a home designed for comfort. It was a fortress built against the brutal winters of the high country. A small corral stood to the left, empty and waiting. Beyond the cabin, a lone, massive oak tree stood sentinel at the edge of the property, its bare branches scraping the twilight sky. Underneath it was a simple mound of earth marked by a wooden cross. Wakely pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He tied off the reins and climbed down. Jamila remained on the bench, swathed in the buffalo robe, staring at the cabin. It looked incredibly isolated. There were no neighboring smokes in the distance, no roads, just miles of unbroken, deadly wilderness. "This is it," Wakely said, his voice flat. He walked to the back of the wagon to unhitch the mules. Jamila slowly unwrapped herself from the hide. She climbed down, her legs stiff and clumsy from the cold and the brutal ride. She stood in the freezing mud of the yard, clutching her small carpet bag. Wakely unlatched the heavy wooden door of the cabin. It creaked on iron hinges. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. Jamila stepped over the threshold. The inside of the cabin was pitch black and freezing, colder than the air outside. The smell hit her instantly. Stale ashes, damp wool, cured meat, and the metallic tang of unwashed traps. Wakely struck a sulphur match against the doorframe. The sudden flare of yellow light revealed a single, large room. It was a bachelor's den of survival. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall. A heavy oak table, scarred by knives and burns, sat in the center. Traps, chains, and stretchers hung from iron nails driven into the log walls. In the corner sat a narrow bed frame, piled high with ragged woolen blankets. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softening touches of domesticity. It was utterly, terrifyingly bleak. Wakely watched her from the doorway. He waited for the tears. He waited for the realization to crush her, for her to scream that she had made a terrible mistake. He watched her grey eyes scan the room, taking in the dirt, the smell, the profound emptiness. She walked to the heavy oak table and set her carpet bag down. She ran a finger over the dusty surface. "The stove," she said, her voice dry and practical. "Where do you keep the kindling?" Wakely blinked, thrown off balance by her lack of hysteria. "Bin by the hearth." Jamila turned, walked to the fireplace, and knelt on the cold stone. She began pulling handfuls of dry pine needles and split cedar from the wooden bin, stacking them with precise, efficient movements. "Bring in the rest of the supplies, Wakely," she said without looking back. "If we don't get this room warm soon, the ink on that marriage certificate is going to freeze." "Hi!" Wakely stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rigid line of her back as she struck a match. He didn't know what he had brought to his mountain, but as the first small flames licked at the dry cedar, casting dancing yellow shadows across her gaunt face, he realized one thing for certain. She wasn't going to break easily. Morning came with the sharp, rhythmic crack of an axe. Jamila woke to a freezing room and an empty cabin. The heavy buffalo robe weighed her down, trapping a small pocket of warmth against the brutal chill of the mattress. She lay still for a moment, listening. The wind had died during the night. In its absence, the sound of splitting wood echoed off the granite cliffs. Sharp as a gunshot. Crack, crack, crack. She pushed the heavy hide aside. The air in the cabin bit into her skin instantly, raising gooseflesh along her arms. She hurried to pull her wool dress over her shift, her fingers numb and clumsy with the bone buttons. The stove was completely dead. Wakely had left hours ago, taking the heat with him. Jamila crossed the rough plank floor, her boots scuffed against the ingrained dirt. The cabin in the harsh light of morning was even grimmer than it had been in the shadows of the previous night. Dust coated every surface like a grey, second skin. Cobwebs thick as rope clung to the ceiling joists. It was a space entirely devoid of softness, a wooden box built to keep out the wolves and the winter, nothing more. She walked to the iron stove, knelt, and began to build a fire. Her hands, still raw from the tavern's lye soap, throbbed as she handled the rough bark of the kindling. Once the flames caught, roaring up the iron pipe, she filled a blackened tin pot with water from a covered wooden barrel in the corner and set it to boil. Then she went to work. She found a stiff broom made of bound birch twigs and began to sweep. The dust rose in suffocating clouds, tasting of ash and dried earth. She pushed back the heavy oak table. She dragged the cast-iron skillets outside and scrubbed them with snow and river sand until her knuckles bled anew. She didn't stop to rest. Idleness invited the creeping panic, the stark realization of exactly where she was and what she had done. If she kept moving, she didn't have to think about the vast, silent miles of nothingness surrounding her. Around noon, she found the coat. It was hanging on a wooden peg behind the door, hidden beneath a tangle of leather harness straps. A heavy wool mackinaw, stained with old pine sap, and something dark and rusted around the collar. It smelled overwhelmingly of mildew and sour earth. Jamila pulled it down, intending to carry it outside to air it out in the pale sunlight. The heavy timber door swung inward before she could take 3 steps. Wakely filled the frame. He carried an armful of split-cord wood, his face flushed from the exertion, his breath steaming. Pine shavings clung to his thick beard. He stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the newly swept floorboards. He stopped dead. His eyes dropped from her face to the heavy coat draped over her arm. The shift in the room was immediate and violent. The air pressure seemed to drop. Wakely didn't drop the firewood, but his grip tightened until the bark groaned beneath his thick fingers. The muscles in his jaw locked into a rigid, dangerous line. "Put that down," he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried a low, rumbling frequency that vibrated in Jamila's chest. She froze. The sheer size of him, blocking the only exit, triggered a primal, deeply buried instinct. The tavern reflex screamed at her to shrink, to apologize, to make herself as small as possible. But she looked at the coat, then back up at his dark, furious eyes. "It reeks of rot, Wakely," she said, forcing her voice to remain level. "It's drawing damp into the wood. I was taking it to the porch. I said put it down." He took a single, heavy step forward. Jamila didn't back away. She felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But she held her ground. She remembered the open, blistered palms he had shown her in the tavern. "I go to the woods. I don't hit." She had staked her life on that promise. Now was the time to test the iron of it. "Is it his?" she asked quietly. "Your brother's?" Wakely flinched. The mention of the name struck him like a physical blow. The anger in his eyes fractured, replaced for a split second by a gaping, raw grief. He looked away from her, staring fiercely at the iron stove. He moved past her, his shoulder brushing inches from hers. He dumped the firewood loudly into the bin, the logs clattering against the stone hearth. He stood there for a long time, leaning his heavy hands against the mantel, his back to her. Elias wore it the day the cat tracked him. Wakely rasped. His voice was thick, choked with something rough and painful. He crawled 2 miles in it, pushed it under a log before he... Wakely stopped. He swallowed hard. I found the coat before I found him. Jamila looked down at the heavy wool in her hands. She saw the dark, rusted stain near the collar for what it truly was. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly heavy. She didn't apologize. Apologies were cheap, hollow things in this brutal country. Instead, she walked to the door, opened it, and draped the coat carefully over the porch railing, in the direct line of the weak midday sun. When she walked back inside, Wakely was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. Jamila moved to the stove. She poured a cup of boiling water over a handful of crushed coffee beans in a tin mug. She carried it to the table and set it down in front of him. The mug clicked softly against the wood. "The mildew will ruin the wool," she said, her tone completely neutral. "The sun will bake it out. It comes back inside before dark." Wakely didn't look up immediately. When he finally lifted his head, the terrifying anger was gone, leaving him looking exhausted and incredibly old. He wrapped his massive, scarred hands around the hot tin mug. "Thank you," he mumbled into his beard. It was a small surrender, a tiny, agonizing shift in the foundation of the cabin. The ghost of Elias Green still occupied the room, sitting heavily in the corner, but for the first time, there was space for someone else to breathe. 3 weeks bled into one another, measured only by the shrinking pile of firewood and the creeping advance of the snow line down the jagged peaks. Routine became their armor. Wakely left before dawn to run his trap lines, a brutal, freezing circuit that took him miles up the frozen creeks. Jamila waged a daily war against the cabin. She boiled laundry in an iron kettle over an open fire in the yard. She rendered bear fat down to tallow for candles. She scrubbed, she mended, she baked hard, dense bread from the meager flour supply. They lived in a state of carefully choreographed avoidance. They moved around each other in the small space like 2 wary wolves sharing a kill, careful never to touch, careful never to ask too much. The marriage was a piece of paper in a tin cylinder. The reality was a boarding house with only 2 occupants. Then the January deep freeze hit. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The air turned brittle, stinging the lungs with every breath. The pines outside cracked in the cold, sounding like distant rifle fire. Jamila stepped out onto the porch, a wooden bucket in hand, heading for the water barrel that sat against the cabin wall. The wind snatched her breath away instantly. She reached the barrel and struck the surface with the iron dipper. It hit with a solid, metallic clink. The water was frozen solid, an impenetrable block of cloudy ice. She cursed softly, a foul word learned from the tavern floors. She needed water for the evening stew. She went back to the porch, grabbed a heavy iron spud bar used for breaking ice, and returned to the barrel. She raised the heavy bar and brought it down hard. The iron bit into the ice, sending a spiderweb of cracks outward, but it didn't break through. She raised it again, putting her back into the swing. The angle was wrong. The iron tip glanced off a curved ridge of ice. The heavy bar twisted violently in her grip. The rough iron tore across her palm, ripping away the healing skin, and the sheer weight of the momentum wrenched her wrist backward with a sickening pop. Jamila dropped the bar. It clanged against the frozen ground. She stumbled back against the log wall, clutching her hand to her chest, a sharp, ragged gasp tearing from her throat. The pain was blinding, a hot, white flare that cut right through the freezing air. Blood began to well up instantly, hot and dark against her raw skin. A shadow fell over her. Wakely had emerged from the tree line, a pair of stiff, frozen beaver pelts slung over his shoulder. He dropped them in the snow the second he saw her slumped against the wall. He crossed the yard in 3 massive strides. "Let me see," he demanded, his voice rough with alarm. Jamila pulled her hand away, curling into herself. "It's fine. I slipped." Wakely didn't argue. He reached out and gently, but immovably, wrapped his enormous fingers around her wrist. He pulled her hand away from her chest. He didn't force her fingers open, merely held her wrist steady while he inspected the damage. The gash across her palm was deep, jagged, and bleeding freely. The wrist was already beginning to swell, hot and angry beneath the skin. "Inside," Wakely ordered. He didn't wait for her to move. He placed a hand squarely on the small of her back and propelled her towards the door. The heat of his hand seeped through the layers of her wool dress, a sudden, startling contrast to the biting cold. He sat her down in the chair by the hearth. He moved with surprising speed for a man his size. He grabbed a clean cotton rag from the mending pile, poured boiling water from the kettle into a washbasin, and pulled a small ceramic jar from a high shelf. He knelt on the stone hearth in front of her. "This is going to sting," he warned, his voice low. Jamila braced herself, turning her face away, expecting the rough, careless handling she was used to from men. But Wakely's hands were remarkably gentle. He dipped the rag into the hot water and carefully dabbed away the blood. He didn't rub. He didn't press. He worked with the slow, meticulous patience of a man used to untangling fragile snares. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and cold sweat. When the wound was clean, he opened the ceramic jar. It smelled sharply of camphor and rendered animal fat. He scooped out a dollop of the pale yellow salve with 2 fingers. "Hold still," he murmured. He applied the salve to her palm. It burned like liquid fire. Jamila hissed through her teeth, her entire body flinching backward. Wakely's free hand shot out, catching her forearm to steady her. His grip was an iron band, absolute and unbreakable, holding her in place while the pain peaked and slowly began to recede into a dull throb. They stayed frozen like that for a long moment. He was kneeling on the hearth, holding her arm, looking up at her face. The firelight threw deep, flickering shadows across his rugged features. The sheer proximity was overwhelming. She could see the individual grey hairs threading through his dark beard, the deep lines etched around his dark eyes by wind and squinting into the sun. He looked down at her hand. His thumb, as thick as a broom handle, lightly brushed the unbroken skin just below her wrist. "You don't know how to swing a spud bar," he said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple observation. "I know how to scrub floors." Jamila shot back, her voice defensive, betraying the sudden, strange vulnerability she felt. "I know how to balance a tavern ledger. Nobody ever taught me how to break ice out of a barrel." Wakely nodded slowly. He didn't mock her. He reached for a clean strip of cotton and began to bind her hand, wrapping the cloth tightly to support the sprained wrist. "Elias used to say," Wakely began, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire, "that the mountain doesn't care what you used to know. It only cares what you can learn before the sun goes down." He tied the bandage off with a neat, precise knot. He didn't let go of her hand immediately. He looked at the stark contrast between their skin, hers pale and scarred by lie, his weathered, dark, and mapped with thick, raised scars from claws and cold iron. "I'll break the ice," he said, looking up into her grey eyes. "You tell me how to read the assayer's ledger when Cutler tries to cheat me on the timber." It was a truce, an acknowledgement of their respective strengths. Jamila looked at the giant kneeling before her. The terrifying bear she had followed up the mountain was gone. In his place was a man, deeply flawed, heavily scarred, but inherently careful. She swallowed the hard, cynical lump in her throat. "Deal," she whispered. Spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent tearing of ice. Groaning cracks echoed through the valley as the frozen creeks shattered, sending torrents of muddy water rushing toward the lowlands. Moisture hung heavy in the air, smelling of wet rot and aggressive new growth. Jamila sat at the heavy oak table, squinting in the harsh morning light. Piles of yellowed papers and thick leather ledgers surrounded her. Wakely had pulled them from a locked cedar chest beneath the bed, the accumulated records of Elias's endless legal battles with the territory. Numbers danced across the pages. Hiram Cutler had been systematically undervaluing the adjacent plots for years, squeezing out desperate homesteaders with manufactured tax liens. Jamila traced a column of figures with a calloused finger, her brow furrowed. Hoofbeats interrupted her concentration. Heavy, rhythmic thuds squelched through the deep mud of the yard. Jamila looked out the small, grease-paper window. 3 riders were pulling up near the corral. They didn't ride like men accustomed to the high country. Their expensive saddles squeaked, and their heavy wool coats were tailored for town streets, not mountain brush. Wakely was already moving. He stepped off the porch, a heavy Winchester rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. He didn't point it, but the implication was clear. A thick-necked man with a bowler hat pulled his bay gelding to a halt. It was Higgins, Cutler's mill foreman. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow, melting near the porch. "Green," Higgins barked. His voice was a grating rasp. "Mr. Cutler sent us up, making a preliminary survey of the timber on the North Ridge." Wakely didn't blink. "Timber ain't for sale. Property is mine." Higgins sneered, shifting his weight in the squeaking saddle. "Property belongs to a recognized household. Cutler had a chat with Judge Harrison. Seems the good judge was drunk when he stamped that paper of yours. A marriage of convenience to a saloon girl doesn't meet the moral clauses of the Homestead Act. We're surveying the trees today. Eviction notices come tomorrow." Wakely's grip on the Winchester tightened. The wood of the stock groaned faintly under the pressure. His shoulders rolled forward, the terrifying primal bear rising to the surface. Wood scraped loudly against wood. Jamila shoved the cabin door open. She stepped onto the porch, carrying a thick, leather-bound ledger. The mountain wind whipped the hem of her faded skirt, but she stood completely still, her spine straight. "Mr. Higgins," she called out. Her raspy voice cut cleanly through the damp air. "Before you trespass on private land, you might want to review Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Territorial Tax Code." Higgins squinted at her, his horse tossing its head nervously. "I ain't talking to you, woman. I'm talking to the trapper." "You are talking to the legal co-owner of this claim," Jamila corrected, stepping down into the mud to stand directly beside Wakely. She didn't shrink from the giant beside her. She anchored him. "My husband's provisional deed was ratified by a magistrate. Moral clauses require a formal hearing in a territorial court, not a bank manager's opinion. Furthermore, if you attempt to cross that fence line, I will personally file an injunction in the capital." She opened the ledger, tapping a specific page. "I spent the last 3 days reviewing Hiram Cutler's mill operations. He has been logging federal land over the boundary line for 2 years. If he challenges our deed, I will take these ledgers to the federal marshal in Denver and demand a full audit of the assayer's office." Silence fell over the yard. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the horses and the distant rush of the swollen creek. Higgins stared at the gaunt woman standing in the freezing mud. He looked at the ledger, then at the massive, armed man standing shoulder to shoulder with her. He wasn't equipped for a legal battle, and he certainly wasn't equipped to take a bullet from a mountain man. "Cutler won't like this," Higgins muttered, hauling violently on the reins. "Tell Mr. Cutler he can send his lawyers, or he can send a fair offer for the timber," Jamila said, her voice dropping to a dangerous flat register. "But if he sends his thugs again, my husband will dig the holes, and I won't lose a moment of sleep over it." Higgins turned his horse, spurring it viciously back towards the trail. The 2 other riders scrambled to follow. Mud flew into the air as they disappeared into the dense tree line. Wakely didn't lower the rifle immediately. He watched the empty trail for a long time, his chest heaving with slow, controlled breaths. The tension radiating from him was palpable, a physical heat in the damp air. Finally, he turned his head and looked down at his wife. Jamila closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the massive, surging adrenaline that was suddenly crashing out of her system. She had bluffed. The ledger proved Cutler was a crook, but getting to Denver before Cutler crushed them legally would have been a miracle. "You would dig the holes?" Wakely asked. A strange, rough sound escaped his throat. It took Jamila a second to realize it was a chuckle. "Only if you hit rock," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. Wakely reached out. He didn't grab her. He simply rested his massive, calloused hand on the top of her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, heavy and warm. "Let's go inside," he said quietly. Wood smoke filled the cabin, carrying the rich, bitter scent of roasting coffee beans. Evening had settled over the ridge, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and grey. Jamila sat by the stove, rubbing the scarred skin of her palm. The wound from the ice spud had healed into a thick, pale line, a permanent addition to the rough geography of her hands. She listened to the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone against steel. Wakely sat at the table, methodically sharpening his skinning knife. He hadn't said much since the riders left. The silence between them had changed, though. It was no longer the wary, calculating quiet of two trapped animals. It was the comfortable, breathing stillness of a shared foxhole. Steel hissed against stone. "Cutler will try something else," Wakely said suddenly, not looking up from the blade. "He's greedy. Greedy men don't stop just 'cause you show 'em a piece of paper." "We will be ready when he does," Jamila answered. She stood, grabbing the rag to lift the hot coffee pot. She walked to the table and filled his tin mug. Wakely laid the knife down. He wrapped his thick fingers around the mug, but he didn't drink. He stared at the dark liquid, his jaw tight. "When I brought you up here," Wakely began, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that seemed to vibrate from the floorboards up. "I figured you'd last till the first heavy snow. Figured you'd take half the gold and beg a wagon ride back down to the valley." Jamila pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She met his dark eyes directly. "I thought about it. The first week. When the damp gets into your bones and the quiet gets so loud it makes your ears ring." "Why didn't you?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine, vulnerable plea for understanding. Jamila looked at the heavy timber walls. She thought about the tavern, the smell of rotting sawdust, the constant suffocating fear of a drunken miner's heavy hand. She looked back at Wakely. She looked at his scarred hands, the hands that had bound her bleeding wrist with absolute, meticulous care. "Because no one ever built a fire for me before," she said simply. "Because when I dropped his coat, you didn't strike me. You just drank your coffee." Wakely's knuckles turned white against the tin mug. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick throat. "Elias built this place for a family," Wakely said, his voice straining. "I just lived in it. I kept it like a tomb. You made it breathe again." He pushed the chair back and stood up. The massive chair scraped against the floorboards. He walked around the table, stopping beside her chair. He hesitated, his hands hovering awkwardly near his sides. Jamila stood up. She didn't wait for him to figure out the geometry of tenderness. She stepped into his space, closing the distance completely. She wrapped her arms around his thick waist, pressing her face against the rough canvas of his shirt. He smelled of pine pitch, cold air, and something deeply, inherently safe. Wakely froze for a fraction of a second. Then his massive arms came around her. He pulled her tight against his chest, burying his face in the crown of her hair. He didn't crush her, but his grip was absolute. He held her like a man holding a lifeline in a raging river. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked Jamila's eyes. She didn't sob. She just let the exhaustion, the fear, and the profound, staggering relief bleed out of her into the coarse fabric of his coat. They stood there in the center of the cabin, bathed in the flickering orange light of the iron stove. The mountain outside was still dangerous. The winter would return. Cutler would inevitably send more men, more lawyers, more threats. But as Wakely's heavy, calloused hand stroked the back of her head, Jamila realized the fundamental truth of the high country. Survival wasn't about avoiding the storm. It was about finding someone strong enough to stand with you while the wind howled. Tomorrow they would walk the fence line. Tomorrow they would count the traps and tally the ledgers. Tonight they simply held on. Friends, thank you for riding along on this rugged journey into the high country. If Wakely and Jamila's fight for their land, their survival, and their unexpected love struck a chord with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow storytelling fans who appreciate a raw, grounded romance without the fluff. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming Wild West dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you do if Cutler's men showed up at your door? See you next time.